August 2026, Berks County, Pennsylvania. Peak spotted lanternfly season, historically the worst weeks of the year, when adults swarm in the thousands and vineyards look like something out of a nightmare. But the reports flooding into Penn State Extension aren't about swarms, they're about silence. Orchards that once dripped with the insects stand eerily empty. Farmers walking their rows can't find them. That was August 2026. By the time researchers started comparing notes, the absence had spread across county after county, and nobody had sprayed. Nobody had coordinated an eradication push. Nobody had done anything at all. Something is killing spotted lanternflies at scale, and it's doing it without us. That's not what anyone predicted. When this insect first established in the United States, the projections were catastrophic. A pest with no natural enemies, spreading unchecked through a multi-billion-dollar agricultural corridor. The question that drove a decade of emergency research was simple. How do you stop something with nothing hunting it? The answer that's emerging from the data is stranger and more unsettling than any intervention humans designed. Something found them first. And the evidence for what that something is, or isn't, still can't fully account for a collapse this fast. I'm covering the full arc of one of the most disorienting ecological reversals in recent American agricultural history, how a single invasive insect went from unstoppable to mysteriously absent, and what the data we have right now still cannot explain. Lycorma delicatula is native to China, Vietnam, and India. It hitchhiked to Berks County, Pennsylvania on imported stone shipments, and the first confirmed US establishment was recorded in 2014. One county. No native predators waiting for it. No parasitoid wasps that recognized it. No fungal pathogens primed to exploit it. The ecological vacuum it landed in was essentially total. The insect feeds on over 70 plant species, grapes, apples, hops, hardwoods, placing it directly inside one of the most economically productive agricultural corridors in the eastern United States. Penn State Extension tracked the spread. Within 4 years, populations had pushed across Pennsylvania and established in 14 additional states. Early economic models put potential losses in the billions. The absence of any co-evolved enemy was the core of every dire projection, because without something hunting it, population dynamics had almost no ceiling. That's the world the researchers inherited in 2014. A pest arriving into a vacuum, spreading faster than quarantine lines could contain it, threatening crops that had never evolved alongside it and had no resistance to offer. The story of what happened next runs through fungal epizootics, predator behavior, imported parasitoid wasps, and a Senate bill that hasn't passed yet. But it starts with a question nobody thought they'd be asking this soon. What finally found it? 4 years before the carcasses began piling up, the spotted lanternfly was still in its opening act. Berks County, Pennsylvania, 2014. The insects had arrived, spread to a handful of townships, and the dominant mood among researchers was one of grim anticipation. Not of collapse, of expansion. Every model pointed the same direction. More counties, more states, more damage. The question was never whether the lanternfly would spread. It was how fast. By the summer of 2018, something had shifted. Field observers working the Tree of Heaven stands along the wooded ridgelines of Berks County started noticing something that didn't fit the models. Lanternfly carcasses. Not a few, scattered here and there, the way dead insects always are. Accumulations, clusters of bodies at the base of trunks, on the undersides of leaves, clinging to bark in postures that looked almost frozen mid-step. And the bodies weren't just dead, they were covered. White and orange fungal growth had consumed them from the inside out, erupting through the cuticle in dense, powdery mats. The insects looked like they had been dipped in chalk and rust. Lab analysis came back with 2 names, Bovarea bassiana and Batcoa major. both entomopathogenic fungi, meaning fungi that kill insects, not by poisoning them from outside, but by infiltrating them. Bovaria bassiana is a soil fungus. It has been living in North American dirt for as long as anyone has been looking. It infects a wide range of arthropods, usually at low background rates, a grasshopper here, a beetle there, nothing that makes headlines. Batcoa major is related, similarly opportunistic, similarly quiet under normal circumstances. Neither fungus had ever been considered a serious check on any insect population at scale. They were background noise in the ecosystem, bit players. But the spotted lanternfly had never met them before, not in any evolutionary sense that mattered. In its native range across China, Vietnam and the Korean peninsula, Lycoma delicatula had spent millions of years developing relationships with the pathogens in its home soil. It had immune responses calibrated to those specific threats. When it arrived in Berks County, it stepped into a microbial world it had no map for, and Bovaria bassiana, encountering this new host at unprecedented density, did what opportunistic pathogens do when a naive population crowds together on a food source. It ran. The results were published in the Journal of Invertebrate Pathology, and the language the researchers used was striking. This was not a gradual decline. This was a local population collapse. The distinction matters enormously. A gradual decline is a trend. A collapse is an event. It has a before and an after. Berks County had a before and an after, which looking back was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. The way the lanternfly had aggregated so densely on those tree of heaven stands, thousands of insects pressing together on the same trunks, feeding in the same spots day after day. In a species with evolutionary experience of fungal epizootics, that behaviour might have been tempered by instinct, by some tendency to disperse when pathogen pressure rises. The spotted lanternfly had no such instinct here. It had never needed one. The very behaviour that made it such an effective coloniser, its willingness to mass in huge numbers on a single host, became the mechanism of its own undoing. But Bovaria bassiana wasn't done yet. Not even close. USDA Agricultural Research Service teams began monitoring Berks County the following year, tracking whether the 2018 collapse was a one-season anomaly or something more durable. The results through 2025 have been consistent. The reductions held. Not perfectly, not uniformly across every stand of trees, but the sustained suppression in areas where the epizootic hit hardest was measurable and real. The fungus didn't vanish after its initial run. It persisted in the soil, in the leaf litter, in the bodies of insects that died and decomposed and seeded the ground with spores. The lanternfly populations that tried to re-establish in those zones ran into the same wall the first generation had hit. If Bovaria bassiana had stopped here, this would be a very different story. A local fungal outbreak in one Pennsylvania county, interesting to entomologists, mostly invisible to everyone else, and ultimately insufficient to change the trajectory of a species that was already spreading into New Jersey, New York, Delaware, Maryland, and beyond. A footnote, but the Berks County epizootic was not a footnote. It was a proof of concept. It demonstrated something that no one had been certain of before 2018, that a native North American pathogen, already present in the soil, could hit a spotted lanternfly population hard enough to crash it. Not wound it, crash it. That changed the questions researchers were asking, and it opened a door that led somewhere no one had fully anticipated. Someone specific saw it coming. A USDA-ARS mycologist reviewing the 2018 field data flagged the Bovaria results as potentially scalable, meaning the fungus might be deployable as a deliberate biocontrol agent, not just a passive ecological actor. She wrote it into her preliminary report. Nobody listened. Not immediately. The agency's attention was elsewhere. The budget lines were already committed, and a single county fungal event didn't carry enough institutional weight to redirect a federal program mid-stride. The moment passed. The report went into a file, and the lanternfly kept moving east. Picture a grey catbird on a warm July morning, working the edge of a tree of heaven stand somewhere in Chester County, Pennsylvania. The bird is not hunting the way a hawk hunts. No speed, no drama, no single decisive strike. It moves methodically. It watches. It returns to the same aggregation of lanternflies on the same trunk 3, 4, 5 times in the span of an hour, picking insects off the bark with the patient efficiency of something that has learned where the food is and sees no reason to stop. By the time it moves on, there are fewer lanternflies on that trunk than there were at dawn. Not zero, fewer. This is what the Cornell and Penn State Joint Tracking Program set out to document when it launched in 2022. Not the dramatic photogenic kills, though there were plenty of those, but the cumulative, unremarkable, daily pressure that native predators were quietly applying to spotted lanternfly populations across Pennsylvania. The program systematically photographed and logged predation events across the state, building a data set that, by the time of its July 2026 joint update, had become one of the most detailed records of native species responding to an invasive insect ever assembled. The praying mantis entries alone are remarkable. Both the Chinese mantis, Tenodera sinensis, and the Carolina mantis, Stagmomantis carolina, were documented ambushing adult lanternflies on tree of heaven trunks with notable regularity. The Chinese mantis is itself an introduced species, brought to North America in the 1890s as a garden pest controller, which gives these encounters a strange recursive quality. An introduced predator, now fully naturalized, hunting an introduced prey on an introduced host tree. The Chinese mantis is large enough to take adult lanternflies cleanly, and the tracking data showed it doing exactly that, particularly in the late summer months when lanternfly adults are most abundant and most exposed. The wheelbug, Arylus cristatus, deserves its own moment here. It is not a charismatic insect in the way a mantis is. It is angular, armoured-looking, with a serrated crest on its thorax that gives it the appearance of something designed by an engineer who was also having a bad day. But it is extraordinarily effective. Wheelbugs and their assassin bug relatives hunt by piercing their prey and injecting saliva that liquefies the internal tissues, then drinking the result. It is a slow kill by insect standards, not the clean snap of a mantis strike, but a prolonged immobilization. The tracking program logged wheelbugs doing this to lanternflies mid-feed, the prey still partially attached to the bark, the predator working methodically and unhurried. The clock was already ticking for every lanternfly in those aggregations. The lanternfly just couldn't hear it yet. And somehow it gets worse if you are a lanternfly. The orb weaver spiders were in the data too, along with something that raised eyebrows when the tracking program first started logging it in numbers. Trichonephila clavata, the Joro spider, another introduced species, this one from East Asia, first established in Georgia around 2013 and spreading steadily northward. By the early 2020s, Joro spiders were appearing in Pennsylvania in increasing numbers, and their large, strong webs were catching spotted lanternflies with what the researchers described as disproportionate frequency. An introduced spider native to the same part of the world as the lanternfly, catching an introduced insect in a new country. The ecosystem was improvising, and that wasn't even the part that got people angry. That came when the tracking data on birds started circulating more widely. Cardinals, grey catbirds, both species documented repeatedly returning to lanternfly aggregations, not sampling the insects once and moving on, but learning the locations and exploiting them systematically. The catbird data in particular showed individual birds making multiple return visits to the same tree of heaven stands over the course of days. And then there were the chickens. Backyard chickens, kept by hobbyist farmers and suburban homesteaders across Pennsylvania, documented as surprisingly effective consumers of spotted lanternflies. Some keepers were reporting their flocks clearing aggregations that had built up on fence lines and garden structures. The data wasn't anecdotal. The tracking program had logged it, photographed it, and included it in the formal dataset. The July 2026 joint update from Cornell and Penn State stated plainly that predation pressure was measurably higher in areas with established native insectivore populations. Not slightly elevated, measurably higher. In zones where bird diversity was strong, where assassin bugs and mantises were well established, where spider populations were dense, the lanternfly numbers told a different story than in areas where those predator communities were absent or depleted. The gallery of predators was real, it was growing, and it was applying pressure that the models from 2014 had never accounted for. But this wasn't just about predation anymore, because the question the data was now forcing into the open was one that made some researchers deeply uncomfortable, and it had nothing to do with which species was eating the most lanternflies. It had to do with whether any of this, the fungi, the predators, the accumulated biological pressure from a continent slowly waking up to a new food source, was actually enough to matter at the scale of the invasion itself. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything. Stand at the edge of a Pennsylvania vineyard in late August, say, Lancaster County, 2025, and watch the grape leaves. The spotted lanternflies are there, as they have been every August for a decade now, pressing their feeding stylets into the canes, weeping honeydew onto the soil below. Wasps circle. A few wheelbugs work the perimeter. A Carolina wren darts in, takes one, is gone in a second. And yet, if you had stood in this same spot in August of 2022, you would have needed to raise your voice to be heard over the sound of them. The sheer density, the weight of wings on every surface, was something people described as biblical. Now, in 2025, you can count individual insects. Something has changed. The question is whether we actually understand what. The Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture has been tracking lanternfly populations at the county level since the early years of the invasion, and the numbers coming out of their 2025 and 2026 survey cycles are striking. In some of the oldest established zones, the counties where spotted lanternflies first took hold a decade ago, populations have declined by 40 to 70% compared to peak years. That's not a typo, by the way. 40 to 70%. In regions where the insect had established itself most completely, the surveys are showing collapses that no one predicted on this timeline. But here is where the biology gets complicated, and where the story refuses to resolve into something clean and satisfying. A single female spotted lanternfly lays between 30 and 50 eggs in a single egg mass. She may lay multiple masses in a season. Each mass is sealed under a waxy coating that looks to the untrained eye like a smear of dried mud on a tree trunk or a fence post or the underside of a patio chair. The eggs overwinter. They hatch in spring. And the cycle begins again with a population that, under favourable conditions, can replace itself faster than almost any predator guild can track. When you are dealing with an organism that reproduces at this rate, the math of suppression becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Most people never heard about this part. The predators we have been watching, the wheelbugs, the spiders, the yellow jackets, the birds learning to tolerate the alkaloid load, they are working against an animal with an enormous reproductive buffer. Consuming adults in August is, in a sense, working at the wrong end of the pipeline. The eggs are already in the ground. The next generation is already sealed away. Cornell entomologists studying population dynamics in the invaded range have noted what they call a lag effect in predator response. Predator populations, whether invertebrate or vertebrate, build only after prey becomes sufficiently abundant to sustain them. The prey has to be there, in numbers, before the predators can specialize, before behaviors shift, before population-level suppression becomes possible. And then, this is the crucial part, the suppression arrives with a delay. Researchers have estimated that lag at roughly 2 to 4 years between peak prey abundance and meaningful predator-driven decline, which means something important about the timeline. The lanternfly reached genuinely explosive densities in the core Pennsylvania counties somewhere around 2021 and 2022. 2 to 4 years of lag puts meaningful predator suppression arriving right around 2023 to 2025. And the survey data from the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture is showing exactly that pattern. Declines concentrated in the oldest established zones, the places where peak abundance arrived first. The lag effect is elegant as an explanation, but it is also incomplete, because the math still does not close. No single predator species in the densities researchers have actually observed in the field accounts for declines of this magnitude on its own. The wheelbug is a ferocious hunter, but it is not numerous enough. The birds are learning, but learning takes time and the numbers are not there yet. The spiders and wasps and mantises are contributing, but contributing to what exactly, at what proportion of the total suppression? When researchers try to model this, when they attempt to assign percentage contributions to individual predator species, the numbers do not add up to 40 or 70% decline. Not even close. What researchers are increasingly pointing toward is something more diffuse and harder to communicate. Not a single cause, but a multi-factor suppression model, the Batcoa major fungal epizootic that began crashing populations in Berks County in 2018 and has since been documented spreading through the range. The accumulated predation pressure from a growing community of generalist and specialist consumers. And something less discussed, but potentially significant, landscape-level changes in the availability of Tree of Heaven, the lanternfly's preferred host plant. Tree of Heaven is itself an invasive species, and in some parts of Pennsylvania, targeted removal programs have been quietly reducing the density of this host. Less host means less optimal habitat. Less optimal habitat means lower reproductive success even before a predator takes a single adult. The fungi, the predators, the host plant pressure, none of them alone explains what the surveys are showing. Together, they begin to approach something that looks like an answer. A biological reckoning arriving not as a single dramatic event, but as the slow convergence of pressures from multiple directions simultaneously. And there is one more actor in this story, one that has been waiting in a quarantine laboratory while all of this unfolds in the fields outside. A tiny wasp, smaller than a grain of rice, that co-evolved with the spotted lanternfly on the other side of the planet. Scientists had been watching it for years, testing it, arguing over it, waiting. The wasps had a narrow window before the invasion either collapsed on its own or entrenched itself permanently, and the clock had already started. There is a certain kind of patience that does not look like patience from the outside. It looks like hesitation. It looks like bureaucracy. It looks to anyone watching the spotted lanternfly spread westward across Pennsylvania vineyard by vineyard, orchard by orchard, like a failure of nerve. The USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service and Agricultural Research Service have been studying 2 parasitoid wasps from the lanternfly's native range in Asia for several years now. The first is Anastatus orientalis, an egg parasitoid, a wasp that finds spotted lanternfly egg masses and lays its own eggs inside them, turning the next generation of the pest into a nursery for its own offspring. The second is Drynus cynicus, which targets the nymph stage. Both wasps co-evolved with the spotted lanternfly over millennia. They know it in the way that only deep evolutionary time can teach. The process for bringing them here is called classical biological control, and it is deliberately, almost maddeningly slow. You collect the candidate species. You test it against every non-target organism you can think of: native insects, native plants, anything the wasp might conceivably parasitize if it cannot find a lanternfly. You publish, you review, you test again. The USDA APHIS report from June 2026 confirmed that host specificity testing is still ongoing. No approved field release. Not yet. The irony is not lost on the researchers doing this work. While Anastatis orientalis sits in quarantine, potentially capable of disrupting the lanternfly's reproductive cycle before populations explode each spring, hitting the pipeline at exactly the right moment. The egg stage, the moment of maximum leverage. The fields outside are running their own uncontrolled experiment. The fungi are spreading. The predators are learning. The surveys are showing declines that no model fully predicted. Nature may already be solving the problem that the wasps were imported to solve. Which brings you back to that cold, open image, the empty fence post, the silent vineyard row, the absence where the swarm used to be. We came with traps and regulations and quarantine laboratories and co-evolved wasps held carefully in glass. And somewhere in the fields, quietly, without announcement, a wheelbug took one. A fungus found one. A bird learned that the taste was worth tolerating. We didn't restore the valley. We returned the animal that knew how and then got out of its way. The real question isn't whether the lanternfly is losing. It's whether we're paying attention long enough to learn why. Subscribe for more comeback stories.